The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a warning that no one cared to hear. In this hard land, mercy was as rare as rain, and hope didn't come easy. But that day, in the spring of 1870, when a cowboy rode past the Hartley place, he saw something that made even the toughest man stop cold. Copper Creek was a lonely settlement, half swallowed by dust and silence. A few scattered homes, a tired saloon, and a general store that sold more dreams than goods. Beyond it, the Hartley homestead sat on cracked earth, the cabin small and leaning against the wind. That's where 19-year-old Eleanor May Hartley lived, though lived was too kind a word. She was a girl whose life had been worn thin by loss and labor. Her father, Thomas Hartley, had once dreamed of finding copper in the hills. Instead, he'd found an early grave when the mine caved in. Since then, the cabin that once echoed with laughter had turned into a place of fear. Eleanor's stepmother, Margaret Blackwood, had arrived soon after the funeral, a sharp-tongued widow with cold eyes and a temper like a branding iron. She claimed she'd married Thomas before he died, and with a forged paper or two, no one in town dared question it. Now she ruled that house like a tyrant. From dawn to dusk, Eleanor worked until her hands bled. She cooked, mended, cleaned, and tended the garden while Margaret sat on the porch, fanning herself and spitting venom with every breath. "You call that clean?" She'd sneer. "My grandmother could work faster, and she's 6 feet under." Eleanor rarely answered. Words only brought punishment. Sometimes it was a slap. Other times a night without food. The bruises faded, but the silence she carried grew heavier each day. In the evenings, when Margaret finally went to bed, Eleanor would steal away to the small creek behind the property. She'd sit on a smooth rock, the water whispering around her bare feet, and dream of the life she might have had, one where kindness wasn't a stranger, and love didn't come with fear. That morning had begun like any other. The sun blazed white over the prairie, the earth cracked and thirsty. Eleanor was bent over the garden, her thin frame trembling under the weight of exhaustion. The beans she'd planted fought to live, curling their leaves against the heat. Inside the cabin, Margaret paced like a restless wolf. She'd received a letter that week, one that had turned her mood sourer than usual. The more she thought, the angrier she grew, until finally she stormed out onto the porch, her voice cutting the quiet like a whip. "Eleanor!" she barked. "You lazy good-for-nothing. You think those beans are going to water themselves?" Eleanor flinched but didn't answer. Her throat was dry, her mind far away. "Don't you ignore me?" Margaret was on her before she could rise. A hard slap sent Eleanor reeling. "Useless! I should have let that traitor take you last spring. Might have made $1 off your sorry hide." The words burned more than the strike. Eleanor blinked back tears, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. That's when the sound of hooves broke through the argument. Both women turned toward the dusty road. A lone rider approached, tall in the saddle, his hat low against the glare. He rode a bay horse that moved like it trusted its master more than the ground beneath it. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Stay put!" she hissed at Eleanor, then fixed a smile onto her face, the kind that fooled no one. The cowboy reined in at the gate. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, voice calm but steady, with the slow drawl of a man who'd seen more miles than most. "My horse is thirsty. Mind if I use your well?" Margaret fluttered a hand toward the pump. "Of course, stranger. Help yourself." "Always glad to aid a traveler." Her tone dripped with false sweetness. But the cowboy wasn't looking at her. His eyes had already found Eleanor, who stood frozen near the washtub, her dress torn at the sleeve, her cheek red where Margaret's hand had struck. Something darkened in his gaze. Not pity, but anger, the kind that ran deep and quiet. "Hot day for such hard work," he said, still watching Eleanor. Margaret stiffened, stepping between them. "The girl's lazy, needs a firm hand or nothing gets done. Half her chores still aren't finished." Eleanor kept her head down, pretending not to hear. "Is that so?" the cowboy asked. He filled a bucket, poured water into a trough, then knelt to let his horse drink. When he stood, his voice was different, low, dangerous. "Funny thing. Don't look lazy to me." Margaret's smile slipped. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying," he replied, his blue eyes steady on hers, "I don't much like watching a woman raise her hand against someone who can't fight back." Margaret's temper flared. "How dare you? That girl is mine to discipline as I see fit." And before anyone could move, she struck Eleanor again, a backhanded blow that split the girl's lip. Eleanor stumbled, falling to the dirt. That's when it happened. The cowboy's hand shot out, catching Margaret's wrist mid-swing. His grip was firm, but controlled. "That's enough, ma'am," he said softly. "You hit her again, and we're going to have a problem." Margaret's face went pale, then red. "Unhand me! This is my property!" He released her, slow and deliberate. "Nobody owns anybody," he said. "Not anymore." For a moment, all was still. The only sound was the creak of leather and the whisper of wind. Then the cowboy looked down at Eleanor, who sat trembling in the dirt. Blood trickled from her lip, her gray eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Don't hurt her," he said, his voice steady and cold. Then louder, a sentence that would change everything. "Sell her to me." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Margaret blinked, stunned. "What did you say?" "You heard me," the cowboy replied, pulling a worn leather wallet from his vest. "You said yourself she's a burden. I'm making you an offer." "Name your price." Eleanor's breath caught. Surely she'd misheard. Surely this couldn't be real. But Margaret's eyes had already lit with greed. And the cowboy's face, calm, unreadable, showed no sign he was joking. That was the moment Eleanor's life turned, though she didn't yet know if it was toward freedom or something far worse. The air between them seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind went silent as Margaret Blackwood stared at the cowboy who had just offered to buy her stepdaughter. Her mind raced faster than her tongue. The shock, the outrage, the temptation, it all mixed together until greed won. Eleanor sat frozen in the dirt, one hand clutching her bruised cheek, the other gripping the ground as if it might keep her from being swallowed whole by what was happening. She could hear her heart pounding louder than the ticking of the porch clock behind her. "You're insane," Margaret finally said, though her voice trembled. "Maybe," the cowboy replied calmly, "but I've got money, and you've got a girl you don't seem to want." Margaret's jaw tightened. "What business is it of yours?" He met her glare without flinching. "Business of decency, ma'am. You said yourself you should have sold her once." "Well, I'm giving you a better deal. You take the money, and she walks out of here free from your hands." Margaret looked at the wallet in his hand. The sight of those bills seemed to burn right through her bitterness. "How much?" quote. Eleanor's stomach turned. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You can't." "Quiet," Margaret snapped, her eyes never leaving the money. The cowboy didn't hesitate. $800. Cash. It might as well have been a fortune. Margaret's lips parted in disbelief. "800? You heard me." His voice was steady, but there was something fierce behind it. "It's more than she's worth to you, and you know it." Margaret folded her arms, pretending to consider. "And what exactly do you plan to do with her, cowboy?" "That's between me and her," he said evenly. "But I'll tell you this much. I won't raise a hand to her. And I won't keep her prisoner." Margaret hesitated for only a moment longer before snatching the money from his hand. She counted it quickly, her lips moving silently as she did. Then, with a final greedy nod, she stuffed the bills into her bodice. "She's yours," she said coldly. "Good riddance." Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked from her stepmother to the stranger who'd just bought her like livestock. The world tilted. "You can't," she whispered again. "I'm not." The cowboy crouched down beside her, his expression softening. "What's your name, miss?" "Eleanor," she said faintly. "Eleanor," he repeated gently. "Can you stand?" She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was careful, respectful. He helped her up slowly, steadying her when her knees threatened to buckle. "Get your things," he said quietly. "Whatever belongs to you." Margaret laughed harshly. "She doesn't own anything. Everything in that cabin's mine." The cowboy turned, his voice suddenly cold as iron. "She'll take what's hers, ma'am. Unless you'd like me to reconsider that money I just gave you." Margaret's face tightened. 5 minutes, she spat. "And if she steals a single thing, I'll send the sheriff after both of you." Eleanor moved toward the cabin like someone walking through a dream. Inside, the air felt different, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves knew her time there was ending. She gathered her few possessions: a worn shawl, her father's Bible, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. She tied them carefully in a small bundle made from an old flour sack. Her hand paused on the doorknob as she took one last look around. The room that had been her prison for months now seemed smaller, darker, and utterly lifeless. She whispered a soft goodbye to her father's memory, then stepped outside. The cowboy was waiting with his horse saddled and ready. He took her small bundle and tied it to the back of the saddle. Margaret stood on the porch, arms folded, watching with a smirk. "Don't think this is some fairy tale, girl. Men like him don't do good deeds for nothing." Eleanor didn't answer. The cowboy helped her mount the horse, his hands steady at her waist. Once she was settled, he swung up behind her, his arm coming around her to take the reins. "Hold on tight," he said quietly. She nodded, gripping the saddle horn as the horse started forward. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the sound of Margaret's bitter laughter. Eleanor didn't look back. They rode in silence for a while, the prairie stretching wide and endless around them. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves against hard earth. Finally, she found her voice. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." The cowboy didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was quiet. "Because no one should have to live the way you were living. And because sometimes a man's got to do what's right even if it looks wrong to everyone else." She turned her head slightly. "You paid for me." "I paid to get you away from her," he corrected. "There's a difference." They rode another mile before he spoke again. "My name's Jake Mitchell. I've got a ranch 2 days west of here. Double M, folks call it. Not much, but it's home. You can stay there until you figure out what you want to do." Eleanor hesitated. "And if I want to leave?" "Then I'll see you safely to wherever you're headed." Quote. The simplicity of his answer made something tighten in her throat. After months of being treated like property, the idea that she could choose her own path was almost too much to believe. When they reached Copper Creek, Jake dismounted and helped her down. He led her into the small courthouse where Judge Brennan sat behind his desk, spectacles low on his nose. Jake laid a paper before him. "I'd like to make an employment contract, Judge. Miss Eleanor Hartley here'll be working at my ranch. Wages, $1 a day plus board. 6 months to start." Judge Brennan raised an eyebrow. "Unusual arrangement, but legal enough. Miss Hartley, do you agree to this of your own will?" Eleanor looked from the judge to Jake. His eyes were steady, patient, waiting for her answer. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I do." The judge nodded and drafted the papers. When Eleanor signed her name, her hand trembled, but not from fear. From the strange, dizzying feeling of freedom. Outside, Jake looked at her with a small nod. "You've got your own say now, Miss Hartley. Nobody owns you. Not me, not her, not anyone." That night, they stayed in town at the boarding house. Eleanor sat at the small wooden table, eating her first hot meal in months, real stew, soft bread, and clean water. Jake said little, but when she glanced up, she found him watching her with quiet respect, not possession. Later, as she lay in a real bed for the first time in months, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, the words he'd said echoing in her mind. "Nobody owns you." She didn't know what waited at that ranch. She didn't know who Jake Mitchell truly was. But for the first time since her father's death, she believed her life might belong to her again. And for a girl who'd been sold to be saved, that was enough to start dreaming. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Dawn broke soft and gray over the Wyoming plains as Jake Mitchell and Eleanor rode away from Copper Creek. The wind was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and promise. Behind them lay a past too heavy to name. Ahead of them, Miles of open land, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at peace. They traveled mostly in silence that first day. Eleanor was not used to being asked nothing of. No cruel voice demanding, no orders to follow. Jake spoke little, but when he did, it was kind. He pointed out landmarks, the river bend where wild mustangs sometimes drank, the ridge that marked the start of his property. By sundown, they reached the Double M Ranch. The land spread out like a painting. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, a sturdy barn, and a cabin built from good pine, smoke curling from its chimney. It was modest, but it looked safe, honest. Jake helped Eleanor down from the horse, steadying her when her feet touched the ground. "It's not much," he said, "but it's home." To Eleanor, it looked like heaven. A grizzled ranch hand named Sam came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His limp was pronounced, but his eyes were sharp. "Boss," he greeted, nodding at Jake before his gaze landed on Eleanor. "And who's this young lady?" "Miss Eleanor Hartley," Jake replied. "She'll be helping around the house for a while." Sam tipped his hat politely. "Welcome, ma'am. You'll find the boss runs a fair place." "Thank you," she said softly, though the word felt strange on her tongue. She hadn't had much reason to use it in months. Jake showed her to the cabin. Inside, everything was clean but simple. A table, a small kitchen area, a stone hearth, and a narrow door leading to a small room. "I fixed it up for you," he said, his tone careful. "Used to be storage. Thought you might want your own space." Eleanor stepped inside. The bed had a colorful quilt. The window looked out toward the mountains, and a tiny shelf held a vase with a single wildflower. She blinked fast, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "It's perfect," she said. Jake nodded, but his eyes lingered a second longer than they should have before he turned away. "Supper's at sundown. Rest a while, Miss Hartley. You've earned it." The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike anything Eleanor had known. She rose early, cooked breakfast, tended the small garden behind the cabin, and kept the place in order, while Jake and Sam worked the cattle. The work was hard, but it was hers. Every meal she cooked, every clean floor, every flower she planted, it all meant something. Jake never treated her like a servant. He spoke to her as an equal, asked her opinions, thanked her for her efforts. Some evenings, they'd sit by the fire in quiet companionship, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock and the crackle of wood. Then, one evening, he brought out a fiddle. "Mind if I play?" he asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Please." The first notes filled the room, rich and aching. The tune carried something of the West in it, lonely, hopeful, and strong. When he finished, she found herself whispering, "My father used to play that." Jake looked at her, surprised. "Did he now?" She nodded, eyes shining. He said it sounded like the wind talking to the mountains. "That's a good way to put it," Jake said softly, and played it again. Over the weeks, something gentle began to grow between them. It was in the way Jake's eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his voice lowered when he spoke her name, the way she caught herself humming when she cooked, feeling lighter than she had in years. But word spread fast in small towns. By midsummer, gossip had reached Copper Creek that Jake Mitchell had, quote, bought himself a woman. People whispered. Some pitied Eleanor, others scorned her. When the Henderson family invited everyone to a barn dance, Jake decided they'd go. "Let folks see the truth," he said. "You've done nothing to be ashamed of." Eleanor's hands shook as she buttoned her best dress, the clean blue one Mrs. Patterson had given her. She had never been to a dance. Her heart raced with fear of the stares she'd face. When they arrived, conversation stopped for a heartbeat. Then whispers rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stood tall beside Jake, though her stomach twisted. Mary Henderson, a sharp-eyed matron with a kind smile, came over first. "Miss Hartley," she said warmly, "so glad you came. My Will's been spreading all sorts of nonsense, and I wanted to see for myself." She smiled knowingly. "I see truth suits you better than gossip." Eleanor managed a nervous smile. "Thank you, ma'am." But not everyone was kind. Constance Simpson, one of the local girls, sidled up with a smirk. So you're the one Jake Mitchell bought? Must be nice to be worth that much. Jake appeared beside Eleanor before she could respond. His jaw was tight. Miss Hartley works for her living, he said evenly. And she's earned every bit of respect due her. Anyone saying otherwise will answer to me. The crowd went quiet. Then, to everyone's surprise, Jake offered Eleanor his hand. Care to dance, Miss Hartley? Her cheeks flushed. I don't know how. Then we'll learn together. The fiddler started up a slow tune, and Jake led her onto the floor. The room faded away. His hand was warm at her waist, his steps steady. She moved awkwardly at first, then found the rhythm. When she looked up, his blue eyes met hers. Steady, sure, full of something she didn't dare name. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. Jake smiled, small and real. You make it hard not to. That night, when they returned to the ranch, Eleanor stood on the porch staring at the stars. They'll keep talking, she said softly. Let them, Jake replied. The truth don't need their permission. Life found its rhythm again, but change was already in motion. Margaret Blackwood hadn't forgotten the $800 she'd taken, or the humiliation. A month later, she rode into town, crying foul to the sheriff, claiming Jake Mitchell had stolen her stepdaughter. Soon, the sheriff and a deputy rode out to the Double M with Margaret in tow. Jake met them in the yard, calm but guarded. Sheriff, he said evenly, Miss Hartley's here by her own will. Judge Brennan himself signed her employment papers. Margaret's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. He bought her like cattle. It's illegal. The judge himself arrived not long after, having heard of the commotion. He listened quietly as both sides spoke, then turned to Eleanor. Miss Hartley, do you wish to stay here? Quote. Eleanor's answer came clear and strong. Yes, Your Honor, I work here for wages, and I wish to stay. Judge Brennan nodded once. Then it's settled. Mrs. Blackwood, you've no claim on her. She's of age, free under the law. Margaret's face twisted with fury. This isn't over. It is, Jake said, his voice low and final. Margaret turned and rode off, her curses fading into the distance. As the dust settled, Eleanor let out a trembling breath. Jake turned to her. You all right? Yes, she whispered. For the first time, yes. In the months that followed, life at the Double M flourished. Eleanor's laughter began to fill the cabin. The garden bloomed, the cattle thrived, and slowly, the pain of the past was replaced with something new, peace. By autumn, the gossip had died, replaced by respect. Folks saw how Jake and Eleanor worked side by side. Equals, partners, maybe something more. And one golden morning, as the mountains blushed with sunrise, Jake stood before her on the porch, hat in hand. Eleanor, he said softly, I can't offer you riches, just this land, my word and my heart. Will you be my wife? Her answer was simple and sure. I already am, in every way that matters. The wedding was small but full of joy. Sam played the harmonica, Mary Henderson brought wildflowers, and the judge who had once given Eleanor her freedom now gave her a new beginning. Years later, when the prairie wind swept across the Double M, folks said they could still hear the laughter of Eleanor and Jake Mitchell, the cowboy and the girl he'd once saved with 7 simple words. Don't hurt her. Sell her to me. Because in that moment he hadn't bought her, he'd freed her.